A child shares their last piece of bread with a stranger. Across the world, another human commits an unspeakable act of cruelty. Same species, same capacity for reason, completely opposite choices. So what are we really? Angels with flaws or demons with occasional virtues? The answer might disturb you more than you think. Welcome to Logic Over Spirit. Today, we're diving into perhaps the most uncomfortable question humanity has ever faced. Are we fundamentally good or fundamentally evil? This isn't just philosophical navel-gazing. This question shapes our laws, our religions, our relationships, and even how we raise our children. For thousands of years, philosophers have wrestled with this paradox. Scientists have probed our brains looking for answers. Religious texts have declared verdicts. Yet we still don't agree. And maybe that disagreement itself tells us something profound about human nature. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll examine what science reveals about our biological wiring, what the world's great religions teach about our moral essence, and what philosophers from ancient Greece to modern times have concluded. We'll look at real experiments that tested human nature under pressure, explore the neuroscience of empathy and cruelty, and examine whether concepts like good and evil even make sense in a universe governed by natural laws. By the end, you might not have a simple answer, but you'll understand why this question matters more today than ever before. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Biological Blueprint. Let's start where all human behavior starts, the brain. Because before we can ask if humans are good or evil, we need to ask if we even have a choice. And neuroscience has some unsettling things to say about that. Your brain is essentially three brains stacked on top of each other. At the base, you have the reptilian brain governing survival instincts. Wrapped around that is the limbic system, managing emotions and impulses. And covering both is the neocortex, the seat of reason and higher thought. These three don't always agree. When you see someone suffering, multiple systems activate simultaneously. Mirror neurons fire in your premotor cortex, literally making you feel what they feel. Your anterior cingulate cortex processes their distress as if it were your own. This is empathy, and it's hardwired. But here's what's interesting. So is aggression. The amygdala, that almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, responds to threats with remarkable speed. When it perceives danger, it can hijack your entire system before your conscious mind even knows what's happening. This is why people can commit acts of violence and later say they don't know what came over them. They genuinely don't. Their amygdala acted faster than their frontal cortex could intervene. So are we wired for good or evil? The uncomfortable answer is both. Studies on infants as young as 6 months old show they prefer helpful characters to harmful ones in puppet shows. They seem to have an innate moral compass. But those same studies also show that infants prefer helpful characters who are similar to them and harmful characters who punish those who are different. Tribalism appears to be as innate as empathy. Primatologist Frans de Waal spent decades studying chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest genetic relatives. Chimpanzees can be shockingly violent, engaging in coordinated attacks and even what looks like warfare. Bonobos, meanwhile, resolve conflicts through sex and social bonding rather than violence. We share genes with both. As de Waal noted, we are bipolar apes, carrying the capacity for both extraordinary kindness and breathtaking cruelty in our DNA. But here's where it gets more complex. Neuroscientist James Fallon made a disturbing discovery while researching the brains of psychopathic killers. He found distinct patterns: reduced activity in the orbital cortex, the area responsible for ethical decision-making and impulse control. Then he scanned his own brain as part of a control group and discovered he had the same pattern. He had the brain of a psychopath, yet he'd lived a normal, successful, nonviolent life. The difference? His childhood. Fallon grew up loved, supported, and secure. The psychopaths he studied had experienced severe childhood trauma. Same brain structure, different outcomes. Nature loads the gun, but nurture pulls the trigger. Or doesn't. This brings us to a critical point about human nature: plasticity. Your brain isn't fixed at birth. Every experience, every relationship, every choice literally rewires your neural pathways. Meditation can thicken your prefrontal cortex. Chronic stress can shrink your hippocampus. Trauma can hyperactivate your amygdala. We're not blank slates, but we're not set in stone either. So what does biology tell us? That we're born with capacities for both cooperation and competition, altruism and aggression, love and violence. The question isn't which capacity is real. They're all real. The question is which one we cultivate. And that takes us beyond biology into the realm of culture, meaning, and choice. Chapter 2. The Evolutionary Paradox. If humans are just survival machines shaped by evolution, you'd expect us to be purely selfish. After all, natural selection favors genes that maximize their own replication. Help others at your own expense, and you should be eliminated from the gene pool, right? Yet humans routinely sacrifice for strangers. We donate kidneys to people we'll never meet. We run into burning buildings to save others. We've built entire civilizations on cooperation. How does evolution explain that? The first answer is kin selection. Protecting your relatives makes genetic sense because they share your DNA. A mother sacrificing for her child is essentially protecting copies of her own genes. As evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane supposedly quipped, he would lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. The math checks out genetically. But we don't just help relatives, we help strangers. This is where reciprocal altruism comes in. If I help you today, you might help me tomorrow. Over time, groups that cooperate outcompete groups that don't. Being good to others becomes a survival strategy. Selfishness is actually bad for your genes in the long run if it means you're excluded from the group. Then there's costly signaling. Generosity and self-sacrifice signal that you have resources to spare and can be trusted. In ancestral environments, being known as generous increased your status and mating opportunities. Acts of goodness become advertisements of genetic quality. Your morality is a peacock's tail. But none of this explains why humans help in anonymous situations where there's no chance of reciprocation or reputation building. Researchers have run thousands of experiments with the dictator game, where one person is given money and can share any amount with a stranger they'll never meet. The economically rational choice is to keep everything. Yet most people share, even when it costs them and benefits no one they'll ever encounter again. This points to something deeper. Evolutionary psychologist Michael Tomasello argues that humans evolved a unique form of cooperation that goes beyond what any other species does. We don't just work together toward shared goals. We have shared intentionality. We can imagine what others are thinking and feeling, coordinate complex plans, and establish social norms that we enforce even when no one's watching. This created what Tomasello calls the cultural ratchet. Each generation builds on the innovations of the last. But this only works if people share knowledge freely, even with non-relatives, even at personal cost. Groups that developed this hyper-cooperative psychology outcompeted groups that didn't. We became cooperatively breeding apes, more like certain species of birds than like our primate cousins. But here's the dark side of that same evolutionary story. Cooperation within groups often went hand in hand with hostility between groups. The same psychological mechanisms that make us empathize with our tribe can make us dehumanize outsiders. We evolved to be cooperatively tribal, not universally altruistic. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has documented this in his work on coalitionary aggression. Chimpanzees and humans are the only species that routinely form coalitions to hunt down and kill members of neighboring groups. This gave us an evolutionary edge, but it also embedded intergroup violence deep in our psychology. We're extraordinarily nice to our in-group and potentially monstrous to the outgroup. So evolution doesn't give us a simple answer about human nature. It explains why we have such contradictory impulses. We evolved to cooperate intensely and to compete ruthlessly, to feel deep empathy and stark tribalism, to sacrifice ourselves for the group while viewing outsiders as threats. We're the species that builds hospitals and concentration camps, often animated by the same tribal psychology. The real question isn't what evolution made us, it's what we do with that inheritance. And that's where human culture, philosophy, and yes, even spirituality enter the picture. Because unlike any other species, we can reflect on our impulses and choose whether to follow them. Chapter 3. Original Sin and Divine Spark. Religious traditions have been answering the question of human nature for millennia, and their verdicts are strikingly different. These aren't just theological abstractions. They shape how billions of people see themselves and others. Let's examine what the major faiths say. Christianity, particularly in its Western forms, often emphasizes original sin. According to this doctrine, humanity fell from grace in the Garden of Eden. We inherited a corrupted nature, prone to selfishness and evil. As the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans, "The good that I would I do not, but the evil which I would not that I do." Left to ourselves, we inevitably choose wrong. We need divine grace to be redeemed. This view profoundly shaped Western civilization. It's why many Christian thinkers were skeptical of human nature and saw strong institutions as necessary to restrain our worst impulses. Thomas Hobbes, though not writing theology, reflected this worldview when he described life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Humans needed a powerful sovereign to keep them from tearing each other apart. But Christianity is more complex than original sin alone. Humans are also made in the image of God, the imago Dei. Even in our fallen state, we retain something divine. We can choose good, we can love, we can be redeemed. Christian history is full of saints and reformers who believed deeply in human potential for goodness when aligned with divine will. Judaism offers a different perspective. There's no doctrine of original sin in Jewish thought. Instead, humans have two inclinations, the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination, and the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. But Yetzer Hara isn't pure evil. It's more like selfish desire, and it's actually necessary. As the Talmud notes, without the Yetzer Hara, no one would build a house, marry, or have children. The challenge isn't to eliminate desire, but to channel it properly through following the Torah. This creates a more balanced view. Humans aren't inherently depraved or inherently perfect. We're works in progress, constantly choosing between impulses. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik described humans as both majestic and humble, capable of great moral heights but always vulnerable to moral failures. We live in that tension. Islam presents yet another view. In Islamic theology, humans are born in a state of fitra, natural purity and inclination toward God. We're not born sinful. The Prophet Muhammad said that every child is born in a state of fitra, and it is his parents who make him a Jew, Christian, or Zoroastrian. Sin comes from forgetting our true nature and succumbing to base desires, but humans are also described as forgetful and weak. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes human frailty and the need for divine guidance. We have free will, but we easily go astray without God's mercy and the structure of Islamic law. As Surah 70 states, man was created anxious, fretful when evil touches him, and grudging when good reaches him. Yet those who pray and are constant in their practice can overcome these tendencies. Eastern religions offer dramatically different frameworks. In Buddhism, the question of whether humans are good or evil doesn't quite fit. Buddhism focuses on suffering and its causes, not moral essence. The problem isn't that we're evil, but that we're ignorant. We don't understand the true nature of reality, the impermanence of all things, and the illusion of the separate self. This ignorance creates craving and suffering. But here's the hopeful part. We have Buddha nature. Every sentient being has the potential for enlightenment. Our true nature, underneath the layers of delusion and conditioning, is awakened awareness. The Dalai Lama has said repeatedly that human nature is fundamentally gentle, and that violence and aggression are not intrinsic but come from fear and ignorance. Meditation and ethical practice can uncover our underlying goodness. Hinduism similarly teaches that our true self, the Atman, is identical with Brahman, ultimate reality. The Atman is beyond good and evil, perfect and eternal. What we think of as our personality, with its moral struggles, is really just Maya, illusion. Our actions create karma that binds us to the cycle of rebirth. But this isn't about being good or evil. It's about waking up to what we really are. Confucianism, which shaped Chinese civilization for over 2 millennia, taught that humans are inherently good but need proper cultivation. Mencius argued that everyone has the beginnings of compassion, shame, courtesy, and moral discernment. These are like seeds that must be nurtured through education and ritual. Humans become evil only when they neglect their moral nature or when circumstances corrupt them. But Confucius's contemporary Zunzi disagreed. He argued that human nature is inherently bad, driven by desires that lead to conflict if unchecked. Only through education, ritual, and law can we become good. This debate between Mencius and Zunzi mirrors Western debates between those who trust human nature and those who do not. What's striking is how these religious views correlate with social organization. Religions emphasizing human sinfulness tend to support strong institutions and clear rules. Those emphasizing human goodness or Buddha nature tend toward more individualistic paths of cultivation. The theology shapes the society, and the society reinforces the theology. But here's the deeper question. Are these religious teachings descriptions of reality or prescriptions for behavior? When Christianity says we're fallen, is that a fact about human nature or a framework designed to make us vigilant against our worst impulses? When Buddhism says we have Buddha nature, is that metaphysical truth or a teaching tool to inspire confidence in our potential? Maybe the question misses the point. Perhaps religious teachings about human nature are less like scientific hypotheses and more like maps. They don't just describe the territory, they help us navigate it. And different maps serve different purposes for different journeys. Chapter 4. The Philosophical Battleground. Philosophy approaches human nature without the divine backing of religion, but with the same intensity of inquiry. And philosophers have been arguing about this for over 2 millennia, reaching wildly different conclusions from the same evidence, human behavior. Let's start with Aristotle, whose influence on Western thought cannot be overstated. Aristotle believed humans have a telos, a purpose or end toward which we naturally develop. For humans, that purpose is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. We achieve this by developing virtues, excellent character traits like courage, wisdom, and justice. Here's the key. Aristotle thought we're not born virtuous or vicious. We're born with the potential for either. As he wrote in the Nicomachean Ethics, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. Virtue is a habit formed through practice. This means human nature is fundamentally neutral but directional. We have a natural tendency toward flourishing, but we must actively cultivate it. Fast forward to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, writing in the shadow of civil war. Hobbes painted a much darker picture. In the state of nature, without government, life is a war of all against all. Humans are driven primarily by self-preservation and the desire for power. We're not exactly evil, but we're rational egoists. We'll cooperate only when forced to by fear of punishment, or when it serves our interests. Morality is a social contract we accept because the alternative is chaos. Jean-Jacques Rousseau violently disagreed. Writing a century after Hobbes, Rousseau argued that humans in the state of nature were noble savages, peaceful and content. We had natural compassion and lived in harmony. It was civilization that corrupted us, creating inequality, competition, and vice. As he famously wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Our social institutions meant to protect us actually deform our natural goodness. Immanuel Kant tried to navigate between these extremes in the 18th century. He argued that humans have a propensity for evil alongside our capacity for good. We're prone to selfishness and can rationalize terrible acts. But we also have a moral law within us, what he called the categorical imperative. We can recognize universal moral duties through reason alone. The struggle between our selfish inclinations and our rational moral sense is the core of human moral life. What's profound about Kant is that he grounded morality not in consequences or divine command, but in rationality itself. To act morally is to act according to principles you'd want to be universal laws. This means morality isn't external to human nature. It's part of what makes us rational beings. We're the creatures who can ask, should I do this? That capacity is both our glory and our burden. The 20th century brought new perspectives shaped by world wars and genocide. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She expected to find a monster. Instead, she found a bureaucrat who thoughtlessly followed orders. Evil doesn't require fangs and horns. It can emerge from ordinary people failing to think, failing to question, failing to take moral responsibility. This connects to Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence. We're not born with a fixed nature. We create ourselves through our choices. We're condemned to be free, forced to choose without any objective guide. This is terrifying. So we often hide from our freedom in bad faith, pretending we have no choice. But that's a lie. We're always choosing, always responsible. For Sartre, there's no such thing as human nature in the traditional sense. There's only the human condition, the shared situation of having to make meaning in an absurd universe. We're neither good nor evil, essentially. We're free, and freedom is what we make of it. Contemporary philosopher Philip Zimbardo, famous for the Stanford Prison Experiment, argues that situations matter more than dispositions. His experiment randomly assigned students to be guards or prisoners in a simulated jail. Within days, the guards became sadistic, and the prisoners showed signs of severe stress. The experiment had to be stopped early. Zimbardo concluded that good people can do evil things in evil situations. Human nature is extraordinarily responsive to context. But other philosophers pushed back. Feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan argued that traditional philosophy, written almost entirely by men, misunderstood moral development. Men tend to think in terms of abstract rules and rights. Women, Gilligan found, often think in terms of relationships and care. Maybe human nature includes multiple moral voices, not just one. Maybe asking if humans are good or evil imposes a male framework on a more complex reality. Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh offered another perspective entirely. He spoke of interbeing, the interconnection of all things. The question is, are humans good or evil? Assumes a separate self that could be one or the other. But this separate self is an illusion. We're not independent entities with fixed natures. We're processes, constantly arising from causes and conditions. In that view, good and evil aren't essences, but patterns of action that cause suffering or reduce it. Here's what's remarkable about this philosophical journey. Despite 2,500 years of brilliant minds analyzing the question, there's no consensus. That might mean the question is unanswerable, or it might mean the question is wrong. Maybe humans aren't fundamentally anything. Maybe we're fundamentally possibilities. Chapter 5. The Laboratory of Human Nature. Philosophy theorizes. Religion prescribes. But science experiments. Over the last century, researchers have designed increasingly clever tests to probe what humans actually do when the abstractions fall away. The results are both inspiring and disturbing, often in the same experiment. Let's start with the studies that make us look good. In the 1960s, researchers began documenting what's now called the bystander effect. The famous case was Kitty Genovese, reportedly murdered while dozens of neighbors did nothing. The story turned out to be more complicated than reported, but it launched decades of research into when people help. Early studies suggested were pretty terrible. People in groups are less likely to help someone in distress than people alone. We assume someone else will act, diffusing responsibility. But here's what later research revealed. The bystander effect is real, but it's overpowered by something stronger: the costs and benefits of helping. When the situation is clearly an emergency, when the person in need is right in front of us, when we have the skills to help, people actually do help, even at significant risk to themselves. Neuroscientist Abigail Marsh studied extreme altruists, people who donated kidneys to strangers. She found their brains showed enhanced responses to fearful faces, particularly in the amygdala. They were literally more sensitive to others' distress. But here's what's interesting. This wasn't entirely innate. Many of these altruists had life experiences that increased their empathy. Human nature might lean toward helping, but it can be amplified. Then there are the studies that make us look terrible. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s showed that ordinary people would administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. Roughly 65% went all the way to the highest voltage, even as the victims screamed and eventually went silent. This wasn't about sadism. Participants showed visible distress. They questioned the experimenter. But they obeyed. Milgram concluded that the capacity for evil lies not in individual pathology, but in ordinary obedience to authority. The Nazis weren't monsters. They were normal people in a monstrous system. But critics have pointed out problems with Milgram's interpretation. More recent reviews of his data show that many participants didn't fully believe the shocks were real. When the setup was more convincing, compliance dropped significantly. And some participants did refuse, showing that authority doesn't override moral sense completely. Human nature might be prone to obedience, but it's not helpless against it. The Stanford Prison Experiment told a similar story. As mentioned earlier, normal college students became cruel guards or passive prisoners within days. But recent investigations revealed that Zimbardo actively coached the guards to be harsh. It wasn't a spontaneous transformation. It was role-playing encouraged by the experimenter. The study tells us more about the power of suggestion than about inherent evil. So which is it? Are we naturally helpful or naturally cruel? Here's where the research gets really interesting. Developmental psychologist Paul Bloom and his colleagues have done hundreds of experiments with infants too young to have learned cultural norms. 6-month-olds prefer puppets that help other puppets rather than hinder them. They'll reach for pro-social characters and avoid antisocial ones. This suggests some basic moral sense is innate. But those same studies show that babies prefer helpful characters who help characters similar to them, and harmful characters who hurt dissimilar characters. We're born with morality, but it's tribal morality. Our innate good nature has innate limits. Economist Ernst Fehr has run countless experiments on cooperation using game theory. Across cultures, people cooperate more than pure self-interest would predict. We punish cheaters even when it costs us. We reward cooperators even when we get no benefit. This is called strong reciprocity. And it's what makes human civilization possible. But Fehr also found that cooperation is fragile. It depends on institutions that make cheating visible and costly. In anonymous settings where defection can't be punished, cooperation collapses. We're conditionally cooperative, not unconditionally good. Primatologist Franz de Waal conducted mirror experiments with capuchin monkeys that might be the most telling of all. 2 monkeys did the same task. One received cucumber slices as reward. The other received grapes, which monkeys much prefer. The monkey getting cucumber was fine with it until they saw their partner getting grapes. Then they rejected the cucumber, sometimes throwing it at the researcher. They had a sense of fairness, of unfairness, really. But here's the catch. The monkey getting grapes never voluntarily shared. They sensed unfairness when they got less, not when they got more. This might be the best summary of human nature that science offers. We have genuine moral intuitions, real capacities for empathy and fairness. But these capacities are limited, biased, and easily overridden by circumstances. We're not blank slates, but we're not fixed quantities either. We're reactive creatures shaped by immediate context more than we'd like to admit. Chapter 6. The darkness we're capable of. We need to talk about the hard cases, because any theory of human nature that can't account for genocide, slavery, and torture isn't a theory worth holding. Humans have committed atrocities of such scale and cruelty that they seem to require explanation beyond ordinary vice. So where does this darkness come from? One answer is psychopathy. About 1% of the population has psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, shallow emotions, manipulativeness, impulsive behavior. Brain imaging shows differences in their amygdala and prefrontal cortex. These are people who genuinely don't feel what we feel when we see others suffer. They're not tormented by guilt. For them, other people are objects to be used. But psychopaths can't explain mass atrocities. The Holocaust required thousands of willing participants. The Rwandan genocide enlisted ordinary farmers as killers. These weren't all psychopaths. Most were normal people who committed abnormal acts. How? Psychologist Albert Bandura studied moral disengagement, the psychological tricks we use to turn off our empathy. First, we use euphemistic language. We don't kill civilians. We engage in pacification or collateral damage. Second, we displace responsibility. I was just following orders. Third, we dehumanize victims. They're cockroaches, animals, and subhuman. Fourth, we compare them to worse acts. At least we're not as bad as them. These mechanisms are frighteningly universal. In study after study, researchers can get ordinary people to hurt others simply by framing the situation correctly. Tell someone the person they're shocking is undeserving, or that the experiment requires it, or that everyone else is doing it, and compliance shoots up. We have empathy, but it has an off switch that's surprisingly easy to flip. Sociologist James Waller wrote extensively on how ordinary men become genocidal killers. He identified several factors: binding to authority, binding to peers, moral disengagement, dehumanization of victims, and what he calls professional socialization. Soldiers, police, and others in hierarchical organizations learn to obey, to value loyalty to the group above all else, and to see outsiders as threats. Add to this the power of ideology. When people believe they're fighting for a greater good, for racial purity or religious truth or national survival, moral restraints dissolve. They're not doing evil. They're doing what's necessary for a higher purpose. Every genocide has been justified in the minds of perpetrators as tragic but necessary. And then there's the normalization of cruelty. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton studied Nazi doctors who performed experiments on concentration camp prisoners. These weren't sadists. Many were cultured, educated men. They underwent what Lifton called doubling, splitting their identity. At work, they were the doctor in Auschwitz, doing what the situation required. At home, they were loving fathers. The mind can hold contradictions that let us be both. History is full of examples. The Milgram and Stanford experiments weren't anomalies. They were models. During World War II, Reserve Police Battalion 101, made up of ordinary German men too old for military service, murdered 38,000 Jews in Poland. Historian Christopher Browning documented how these men, initially reluctant, became efficient killers over time. Killing became routine. Some even volunteered for the worst assignments. But here's the critical point that gives us hope. Not everyone participated. In every genocide, there were rescuers. In every corrupt system, there were dissenters. They were minorities, often tiny minorities, but they existed. This tells us something vital. The situational forces that push toward evil are powerful but not irresistible. Human agency remains. Philosopher Hannah Arendt interviewed many rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. She expected to find moral giants, people driven by deep philosophical convictions. Instead, she found something more mundane. They were people who'd learned early in life to think for themselves, to trust their own judgment over authority. When told to participate in evil, They simply said no. Not out of heroism, but out of an inability to see another way to behave. This connects to what psychologist Erwin Staub found studying altruists. He discovered that helping often starts small. Someone takes a minor action to help, and this shifts their self-concept. They become someone who helps. This makes the next bigger act of help more likely. Goodness, like evil, is often a path, not a decision. So what does the dark side of human nature tell us? That we're capable of monstrous acts. Those situations matter enormously. That our empathy is selective and easily manipulated. But also that we retain choice. That moral courage exists, and that how we see ourselves shapes what we become. The darkness is real. So is the light. The question is which one we feed. Chapter 7. The Great Synthesis. So where does this leave us? We've examined biology, evolution, religion, philosophy, and experimental psychology. The picture is complex, contradictory even, but maybe we can pull together a synthesis that honors the truth of human nature in all its messiness. Here's what seems clear. Humans are not blank slates. We come equipped with innate capacities shaped by millions of years of evolution. We have empathy circuitry, fairness intuitions, capacity for language and culture. But we also have tribal instincts, capacity for violence, and self-serving biases. These aren't bugs. They were features that helped our ancestors survive. Second, human nature is plural, not singular. We don't have one nature. We have multiple, sometimes conflicting systems in our brains. The rational part that plans for the future, the emotional part that reacts to immediate threats, the social part that cares what others think, the selfish part that wants more. These aren't always aligned. Being human means living with internal conflict. Third, context matters enormously. We're not fixed quantities. We're responsive creatures. Put us in situations that bring out the best, and we'll surprise you with our goodness. Put us in situations that bring out the worst, and we'll horrify you with our cruelty. The Stanford Prison Experiment and the Reserve Police Battalion tell the same story. Ordinary people in malevolent systems do malevolent things. But, and this is crucial, context isn't destiny. Fourth point, we have agency. Not unlimited free will, perhaps, but real choice within constraints. The rescuers during the Holocaust, the refusers in the Milgram experiment, the dissenters in corrupt organizations, they prove that situational forces can be resisted. It's hard, it requires courage, and often comes at great cost. But it's possible. Fifth, human nature is developmental. We're not born fully formed morally. The capacities we develop depend on our experiences, especially early in life. Children raised with love, security, and moral modeling grow up very different from children raised with abuse, neglect, and violence. The James Fallon case makes this clear. Same brain structure, different outcomes based on environment. This means human nature is more like a range of possibilities than a fixed point. Imagine a graph with good on one axis and evil on the other. Humans don't occupy a single point. We occupy a probability cloud, a zone of possibility. Where any individual ends up in that zone depends on genes, early environment, culture, circumstances, and choices compounding over time. Sixth, culture shapes nature. We're not just biological creatures, we're cultural creatures. The stories we tell about human nature, whether religious narratives or secular philosophies, actually influence what we become. If you're raised believing humans are inherently sinful and need restraint, you'll be more vigilant about your impulses, more accepting of rules. If you're raised believing humans are inherently good, you'll trust yourself and others more. Neither belief is simply true or false. They're lenses that focus attention differently. And through the observer effect, they help create the reality they describe. Culture isn't epiphenomenal to nature. It's part of how nature expresses itself in our species. Seventh, progress is possible but not guaranteed. We can point to genuine moral progress over history. The abolition of slavery in most of the world, the expansion of rights, the decline in violence per capita documented by Steven Pinker. But we can also point to backsliding, to new forms of cruelty, to stubborn persistence of tribalism and violence. We're not on a predetermined path toward enlightenment or doom. We're walking a knife edge, and which way we fall depends on choices made now. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum writes about the fragility of goodness. Moral excellence requires both internal virtue and external conditions. You can't be generous in poverty. You can't be brave without danger. You can't be just in chaos. This means that creating good humans requires creating good conditions. It's not just about individual moral development. It's about building institutions, cultures, and systems that make goodness easier and cruelty harder. So are humans good or evil? The question assumes a dichotomy that doesn't fit the evidence. We're not one or the other. We're both and neither. We're works in progress, unfinished symphonies with the capacity to become either sublime or catastrophic depending on countless factors, many beyond our individual control, but some very much within it. The philosopher Kant might have said it best. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. We're crooked timber, flawed, inconsistent, self-contradicting. But from this crooked timber, we've built cathedrals and symphonies, science and civil rights movements. We've also built concentration camps and weapons of mass destruction. Both are authentically human. The question isn't what we are, essentially. It's what we're becoming. And that's not determined by our nature. It's determined by our choices, individual and collective, in response to that nature. Chapter 8. What this means for how we live. Understanding human nature isn't just an intellectual exercise. It has profound practical implications for how we structure society, raise children, design institutions, and live our individual lives. So let's get practical. If humans have capacities for both good and evil, responsive to context, this suggests we need to focus intensely on creating contexts that elicit good. That means designing institutions with transparency and accountability. The Holocaust happened partly because ordinary people could participate in atrocity at a distance through bureaucratic procedures that hid the human cost. Modern institutions need checks and balances precisely because we can't trust any individual or group with unchecked power. It means taking education seriously, not just as information transfer, but as moral formation. If human nature is developmental, then how we raise children matters desperately. Children need secure attachment, consistent moral modeling, and practice making ethical choices. They need to develop the habit of thinking for themselves, questioning authority when necessary, and taking moral responsibility. This isn't indoctrination. It's cultivation of capacities that are latent but not automatic. It means being humble about our own moral certainty. If context shapes behavior so powerfully, then that person you judge harshly might be you in different circumstances. This doesn't excuse evil acts, but it complicates our response. Punishment matters, but so does addressing the conditions that produce harmful behavior. We need both justice and prevention. On a personal level, understanding human nature means recognizing your own capacity for self-deception. You're not immune to moral disengagement, tribalism, or situational pressure. The Milgram participants didn't think they'd shock people to death. The Stanford guards didn't think they'd become cruel. You probably don't think you would either. But the data says otherwise. Vigilance about your own moral blind spots isn't paranoia. It's realism. It means choosing your situations carefully. If you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, then who you surround yourself with isn't trivial. If situations bring out different versions of you, then the situations you enter matter enormously. Want to be more generous? Put yourself around generous people and in situations where generosity is normal. Want to be more courageous? Practice small acts of courage until they become part of your identity. It means developing practices that strengthen your better angels. Meditation increases activity in brain regions associated with empathy and self-control. Reading literary fiction improves theory of mind. your ability to understand others' perspectives. Volunteering creates neural pathways for pro-social behavior. These aren't just nice activities. They're tools for becoming who you want to be. It means recognizing that moral growth is lifelong. You're not done at 25 or 45 or 65. Every experience is shaping you. The question is whether you're directing that shaping or letting it happen passively. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. In light of what we know about human nature, we might add, the unexamined life is morally dangerous. It means taking systemic evil seriously. Personal virtue matters, but it's not enough. If situations shape behavior, then transforming situations transforms behavior at scale. Fighting racism requires not just being personally unprejudiced, but dismantling systems that make prejudice easy and profitable. Fighting corruption requires not just personal integrity, but institutions that make corruption risky and transparent. And it means holding the tension. You're neither purely good nor purely evil. You're capable of both. The question is which capacity you cultivate moment by moment, choice by choice, day by day. This isn't resolved once. It's negotiated constantly. Being human means living with this ambiguity, this freedom, this responsibility. The existentialists were right about one thing. We're condemned to be free. Not free from our biology or our circumstances, but free within them. Free to choose which voice in the internal parliament gets the microphone. Free to build the contexts that make goodness more likely. Free to become slightly better versions of ourselves than we were yesterday. That's not a satisfying answer in the way that declaring humans fundamentally good or evil would be. It puts the burden on us. We can't blame our nature or society or evolution. We have to own our choices and their consequences. But maybe that's exactly the answer we need. Not comfort, but challenge. Not certainty, but responsibility. Conclusion. We started this journey asking whether humans are good or evil. We've traveled through neuroscience and evolution, through the world's great religions and philosophical traditions, through experimental data and historical atrocities. And if you're waiting for a simple answer, I'm going to disappoint you. Because the evidence doesn't support a simple answer. Humans are astonishingly complex creatures with competing drives, multiple brain systems, cultural programming, and moment-by-moment choices all swirling together. We contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman said. We contradict ourselves because we're large. But here's what we can say with confidence. The question of human nature matters. It shapes how we raise our children, structure our laws, design our institutions, and see ourselves. Getting it wrong has consequences. Assume humans are angels, and you'll be betrayed. Assume humans are devils, and you'll create the very dystopia you feared. The truth is more nuanced and more hopeful. We're neither angels nor devils. We're animals with an unprecedented capacity for reflection, cooperation, and moral reasoning. We're also animals with deep tribal instincts, capacity for cruelty, and talent for self-deception. Both are real. Both are us. What tips the balance? Context matters enormously. Put people in situations that activate their worst impulses, provide moral cover for cruelty, and diffuse responsibility, and you'll get atrocity. Put people in situations that reward cooperation, make them accountable, and appeal to their better nature, and you'll get surprising goodness. But context isn't everything. Agency exists. In every dark situation, someone refuses. In every opportunity to help, someone steps forward. We're not puppets of our circumstances. We're influenced by them, yes, but we retain the capacity to choose differently. And here's the part that should both terrify and inspire you. You're making that choice right now, not once in some dramatic moment, though those come too, but in the small decisions accumulating over a lifetime. How you treat the person who can do nothing for you, whether you speak up or stay silent, whether you think about your biases or assume you don't have them, whether you build the habit of kindness or the habit of indifference. These choices compound. They shape your brain literally, creating neural pathways that make some actions easier and others harder. They shape your character, that relatively stable pattern of response we call personality. And collectively, they shape culture, that shared set of norms that guides everyone's choices. So the answer to whether humans are good or evil is this: we're both potentially, and which potential actualizes depends on a complex interaction between our biology, our development, our context, and our choices. We're works in progress, always. The symphony isn't finished. We're still composing it, note by note, choice by choice. This means the future isn't written. We could be heading toward a more enlightened world where our better angels prevail more often. Or we could be heading toward dystopia where our tribal, violent impulses run wild. The answer depends on what we do next. That's the burden and the opportunity of being human. We don't get the comfort of saying our nature made us do it. We have to own our choices. But we also get the extraordinary privilege of shaping what we become, individually and collectively. No other species has that. It's our unique gift and responsibility. So here's what I want you to take from this. You're more capable of both good and evil than you probably think. The situations you enter matter more than you probably realize. The small choices you make compound more than you probably appreciate, and you have more agency than you probably feel, which means the question isn't really whether humans are good or evil. The question is, what kind of human are you becoming? What contexts are you creating? What choices are you making? What version of human nature are you cultivating in yourself and encouraging in others? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they're the right questions. And asking them, really asking them, and living with the discomfort of the answers might be the most human thing. If this exploration challenged or changed how you think about human nature, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your perspective. Are we fundamentally good, fundamentally evil, or something more complex? What experiences have shaped your view? And if you found value in this deep dive, subscribe to Logic Over Spirit. We're building a community of people willing to ask hard questions without easy answers, to follow evidence over comfort, and to think deeply about what it means to be human in a complex world. Hit that notification bell because next time we're exploring another question that sits at the intersection of science, philosophy, and how we live. Is free will an illusion? Everything we've discussed today about moral responsibility depends on whether we actually have a choice or whether that's just a comforting story we tell ourselves. Share this video with someone who needs to think deeply today. These conversations matter more than ever. The algorithms reward outrage and simplicity. We're choosing depth and nuance. But that only works if people like you spread the word. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep becoming the version of yourself that you'd be proud to meet. Thanks for watching Logic Over Spirit.